It's good to have an excuse to come up to Salem today. I was just saying that I like to stop in Ankeny on the way up and down when I'm going up I-5. So I'll go into Pintail Marsh on my way home there this afternoon because I've heard that the shorebirds have been coming through there lately, and maybe there'll be a pectoral sandpiper or something else interesting out there. But for now, for this afternoon here, it's good to be here, and without really too much further ado, because we've got some good stories to go through, I just want to share you a few adventures that I went on in this little trip that I took a couple of years ago in 2015. So this bird that you've been staring at here is called a sword-billed hummingbird. I think this is the only bird in the world that has a beak longer than its own body. You can see these in South America. This one was in Colombia. They're in Peru and Ecuador, also up in the Andes Mountains. But I think my favorite feature of the sword-billed is not necessarily the beak. It's actually the color of its feet, which are bubblegum pink if you get a close enough look like this, which I just think is very unusual and cute for a weird hummingbird like that. Let's see if this clicker works. Yes. So, you know how when you're traveling to a foreign country, they always give you this little piece of paper as you're coming in for a landing. They usually pass this out on the plane. People have had no sleep and nobody has a pen to fill the thing out, so fights are breaking out in the aisles. But this is an immigration form, and I can say from personal experience, having filled out quite a few of these forms over the past few years, that most immigration forms around the world have most things in common, including they almost all have a spot for occupation. Which I don't really know about each and every one of you, but I kind of have a hard time sometimes describing myself and exactly what it is that I do in one concise word. So I've written all kinds of things on these forms over the years. For a long time, I was just putting writer, which I figured was a nice, suitably vague, all-encompassing term. And that was until April of 2015, when I came down in the country of Jamaica. And I walked up to the immigration counter at the airport, and the guy read my form, and then he looked me in the eye, and he said, "Well, what kind of a writer are you?" I was kind of taken aback, and I said, I write books. And he said, "What kind of books?" And I said, "Books about birds." And there was this kind of awkward pause. Well, you could see he was sizing me up, this single male, disheveled-looking traveler coming into Jamaica with no luggage to speak of, saying he writes about birds of all things. And he started getting really suspicious and asking me all these searching questions about who I was and where I was from and what my intentions were for the country of Jamaica. And I really wanted to say, look, I'm on a round-the-world bird-watching binge, trying to become the first human in recorded history ever to see 5,000 species of birds in one calendar year. I've got 27 hours to see all 29 endemic species of birds on this tiny Caribbean island. My friends are waiting outside on the curb. Will you please just let me through? Which I did not say. And he eventually did sort of begrudgingly let me pass. But I had learned my lesson. So on every single one of these immigration forms, ever since then, I have just written bird man, and nobody has ever said a word about it. How many people saw this movie or maybe heard about it when it came out? Yeah, excellent, a few of you. This was a Hollywood flick starring Jack Black, Owen Wilson, and Steve Martin, playing bird watchers, which came out in 2011, a few years back. This was actually based on a true story about three gentlemen who went around North America in 1998 trying to outdo each other by spotting as many birds as they could in one calendar year. But the whole idea of a big year actually goes back much further than that in the birdwatching scene, even back to the days of Roger Tory Peterson. Way back in the 1950s, Peterson did a big trip a road trip across the US with a British friend of his named James Fisher. And he ended up writing that into a book, which I highly recommend if you've never read, called Wild America. But it was in that book, literally in a minor footnote in the last chapter, that Mr. Peterson wrote something like, "During my travels in 1953, I observed 573 species of birds, period." And he didn't really mean that, like throwing a gauntlet exactly, but other people read that footnote and kind of took it that way and said, well, I could see more birds than that. And so this idea of the big year was born. And the stakes have been escalating and escalating in the decades ever since, at least on a North American scale. And so today, you've got guys like Olaf here, did a big year with some special rules in 2013, just a couple of years ago, where he said he had to find every bird in the nude. Not the bird himself. He said he could not spot the bird and then take his clothes off. He actually had to be naked when he first found it for it to count on his list. He still ended up with like 600 species of birds by the end of that year, which I think is incredible that he didn't get arrested 12 times over the course of this adventure. But in any case, that's kind of where we've come these days with big years, at least on a continental scale. And yet, nobody had ever really taken this big year concept and applied it properly, I thought, to the whole planet, which I always thought was kind of interesting, because if you look at the world from a bird's eye view, they don't need visas and passports and immigration forms and all the rest of it. Birds do not recognize our borders at all. And so if you wanted to do the ultimate big year from a bird's perspective, then you really have to take on all of planet Earth while you're at it. And there was some precedent for this. In 2008, a pair of British twitchers, as they call themselves over there, Alan Davies and Ruth Miller, did a bunch of birding trips, and by the end of that year, 2008, they had seen 4,341 out of the 10,000 or so birds in the world, which was good enough for a new single-year world record. I read their travelogue, The Biggest Twitch, and was quite inspired by this whole idea. And I guess, kind of like all those people who read Peterson's book in the 1950s, then I got to the end and I thought, wow, I could see more birds than that if I really put my mind to it and had a whole year to work on it. But for me, I think this big year came through a somewhat more circuitous path. And it really started personally in the summer of 2011. Incidentally, the same year that Hollywood movie was out in theaters, I was on a whole different adventure. I went and hiked the entire Pacific Crest Trail, which is about 2,650 miles. It goes from the border of Mexico all the way up through California, Oregon, and Washington to the Canadian border. That's a whole different story. But I will say, when you spend 4 months literally wandering through the woods all day, every day, much of that time by yourself, at some point, your mind kind of starts to wander as well. And I started thinking of other crazy ideas and what's the next great adventure going to be. And I started thinking about big years because I'm a birder and that might be kind of fun. And at some point, I started thinking while hiking about hypothetical global big year strategy, which could keep me going for days at a time on the trail, just thinking about all the ins and outs of such an operation. And so by the time I made it up to Canada at the end of that summer, I kind of had this plan sketched out in the back of my mind, just in case the opportunity should ever happen to come up. And then in 2014, I wrote a book called The Thing with Feathers, which is all about bird behavior. You don't really expect a book of essays about bird behavior to become anything like a bestseller exactly, but It kind of was. It was on the New York Times bestseller list very briefly, and it was in People magazine and The Economist. It's now been translated into 10 or 12 different languages, and that all kind of blew me away, honestly. And after that happened, I said, well, okay. And I sat down, and I wrote a proposal that essentially said, for my next book, I want to go around the world and look at birds for a year and write a story about it. And I sent this off, kind of laughing about it. And then the publisher, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, came back and they said, yep, sounds like a great idea. In fact, we'll give you an advance up front that should be enough just about to cover the cost of the entire trip. And that's when I suddenly went, oh, crap. So, just in terms of strategy, I knew from the very start that although this was an international trip in scale, obviously, I still wanted to keep this adventure as local in scope as possible. So, I made a couple of special rules for myself, fully clothed, of course. I said, first of all, every bird would have to be seen by me and at least one other person, which incidentally would give me witnesses for all of these sightings. And all of those other people would have to be locals living in the same country that I was visiting. So no hiring international guides to show me around or importing my friends from back home to keep me company. This was more about seeking out like-minded bird nerds in all of these far-flung places, contacting them ahead of time, saying, hey, I'm doing a big year. Can I come sleep on your couch for a few days? And do you want to do some birding? And so this, for instance, is just a group of some of the birders who took me out for one morning in northern Borneo. When I arrived there, you start multiplying this out, and by the end of this trip, I would have been out in the field with literally hundreds and hundreds of different local birders in all of these different places. I have learned a few lessons about packing light from backpacking the PCT, and I applied those to this trip as well. This is pretty much everything I took for an entire year on the road. I went down to REI in Eugene, and I got myself a 40-liter backpack, you can see there, which is small enough to put under the seat of an airplane. And then I told myself, well, if it doesn't fit, then I guess I don't need it for this trip. Although I definitely did need a spotting scope and a tripod, which you can see there. That took up about half of my available weight restriction. So that left just enough room around the edges for an extra pair of underwear and some malaria medication for parts of Africa and other odds and ends. That silk thing is a sleeping bag liner that I could wriggle up inside and sleep on people's floors when I had to. But other than that, I think it's really true that the farther you go, the less you need to take with you along the way. Although, one thing I definitely could not pack was reference books. And unfortunately for a birder, you kind of need your field guides. This is just some of the field guides covering the countries I plan to visit along the way. So I ended up, before I set out, painstakingly going through every single one of these guides and either scanning or photographing all of the identification plates and loading those as digital files onto my phone and my laptop. So I had this whole library with me in the field, which was exquisitely useful for being able to do my homework, but it was quite a bit of work to do all of that scanning up front. And then, the fun part, okay, so you've got 365 days to track down as many birds as possible on Earth. Where do you want to go? I remember as soon as I knew that I was going to do this, I laid out a map on my living room floor, and I started enthusiastically putting down dots on all of the priority A-list places that I absolutely had to visit. And after about an hour and a half of that, I suddenly woke up and realized that just to get to those places was going to take me about 10 years. It turns out that 1 year is a remarkably short amount of time to be trying to cover this much territory, which meant that I had to be pretty strategic about prioritizing the places with the most biodiversity, obviously, which tends to be concentrated in the tropics, but also not forgetting about places with lots of endemic birds that you can't see anywhere else. So for that reason, especially some of the islands like Jamaica and Madagascar and some of those Asian islands were pretty important too. Once I'd laid this out, I decided I would approach it as a continuous one-way trip, more or less going west to east, point to point, which meant that I would not be going back home at all during this year, except for once when I passed through the US about halfway through. And I would have new territory to look forward to ahead of me right up until the very end, which I figured would help keep that momentum moving right along. And so, literally at the stroke of midnight on the 1st of January, 2015, I found myself floating on a Russian ship off the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula. Because I figured if you're going to see the world, then you might as well start at the end of it and work your way back. And I really wanted one of my first birds of the year to be some type of penguin, which I am personally inordinately fond of. And as it turned out, the chinstrap went down that first morning as bird number 4. The very first bird I saw just after midnight was a nice Southern Ocean seabird called a Cape petrel, which I figured was a nice good omen for things to come. And I was off and running. But I feel like this is kind of how a lot of people see birding, and especially this type of birding where you go out somewhere, you find some awesome bird, like a chinstrap penguin in Antarctica, and you sneak up on it and you get as close as you can. Maybe you take a photo, or maybe not necessarily required. And then at some point, you go, yes, and then you smack a high five with your friend, and then you go, check. And you turn around, and that bird then instantly just becomes another number on your list. And I guess by kicking things off in Antarctica, which strategically speaking was probably just about the worst possible place. There's only like 20 birds on the entire continent of Antarctica. I wanted to make this kind of subtle statement from the very beginning that, yes, my goal was to find 5,000 birds by the end of this year. That was the motivation. But for me, it wasn't just about the numbers and the listing part of it, because, well, if you just take one step back, you can see it's not just about the bird, but about the people that are there with you enjoying this experience. And if you take another step back, you can see it's also about these amazing landscapes and environments that you get to visit when you're looking for birds along the way. There are some penguins in this picture, by the way, right there, for a sense of scale of that massive sea ice in Antarctica. So, yeah, it was about the birds. It was about the people, the places, the cultures, the foods, the languages, the environments, the adventures, the misadventures, everything that goes into a big trip like this. That's why I wanted to do this big year. However, after almost a full week in Antarctica at the very beginning, I think I still needed to find 4,983 more birds to make it to my goal. So I did kind of have to hit the ground running when I got up into South America. And I started gradually working my way north. By the time Valentine's Day came around, the 14th of February, I was in central Peru. And that afternoon, I got higher than I've ever been anywhere in my entire life. This is at a place called Ticlio Pass, which is at about 16,000 feet above sea level. I actually started that same morning in Lima, which is at sea level, so I had a pretty killer altitude headache by the time this photo was taken, but it was more than worth it because the birds in central Peru are spectacular with tons of endemics and the ultimate tropical birding experience. So I was going to spend the next couple of weeks birding all around different parts of Peru with this gentleman whose name is Gunnar. I'm actually going down to Peru in a couple more weeks to spend several more weeks birding with him down there. He's a Swedish birder who moved to Peru several decades ago when it was actually kind of a sketchy place for foreigners to travel to, just because he wanted to be immersed in the birds of this amazing tropical country. And as far as I can tell, Gunnar has pretty much flourished there ever since. In fact, when I first sent him an email outlining my plan to see if he might be available for a few days, he immediately replied with one sentence in all caps that just said, "I am your man," with like 10 exclamation points. And when I arrived, I realized he always wears this hat, again in all caps, embroidered across the front, "More birds." So I figured he probably was. We had some adventures together in Peru. We went to the rainforest in southeast Peru during the height of the rainy season, and it just never stopped raining on us there. I got a case of chiggers on my feet, which was kind of itchy there for a while. This bus hit a tractor in the middle of a highway, incidentally on the same day that I came down with a severe case of the respiratory flu, which was kind of a bummer. This bus got stuck on a bridge, and that delayed us for several hours while they tried to figure out how they were going to dig it out of there. And then we had a dead battery in the middle of a driving rainstorm in the absolute middle of nowhere. Once we got that sorted out, there were several flat tires. We got stuck in the mud multiple times trying to get up Manu Road during the wet season and had to be pulled out by passing vehicles. There was a landslide, had taken out the road. People been sitting here for 2.5 days cooking their food on campfires, waiting for the heavy equipment to clear this landslide. And we actually timed it pretty well. We only had to wait for about 3 hours before we were able to squeeze through this one, only to find that there was another landslide several kilometers farther up. And it didn't even matter at that point because an agricultural workers' strike had shut down the highland area that we wanted to visit. And so it was on to plan X or Y or whatever it was at that point. And yet, Gunnar and I persevered, and we eventually made it to this patch of elfin cloud forest in central Peru because I wanted to see a bird there called the golden-backed mountain-tanager, which is super endemic. Basically, the only place you can find a golden-backed mountain tanager is in the forest in this photo. And even to get to this spot, Gunnar and I had to leave our accommodation at about 2:00 a.m. and then drive this heinous one-lane track hacked into the side of a mountain to get to the top at dawn to then be in position to walk into this forest and look for this golden bird that was only first scientifically described in the 1970s and has not really been seen by that many people in the years since then. Well, I don't know what the big deal is. Like 30 minutes after we walked into the forest, this bird pops out of a tree right in front of us, bright yellow with black wings and a black tail. It's got a little bit of blue on top of the head as well. Gorgeous. Absolutely unmistakably the golden-backed mountain tanager. Kind of nice to get an easy bird for a change in central Peru. So that went down as 11:26 by mid-February. Although, as it turned out, the saga of the golden-backed mountain tanager was maybe not quite over yet, because when eventually we lost track of this bird and it flew off into the forest, and Gunnar and I exchanged high fives, and then we retraced our way back to where he had parked our van at the top of this mountain in the half light of dawn. In all the excitement, we'd got it parked in the ditch in the one spot where, unfortunately, once again, we were irretrievably stuck in the mud. So I was in a pretty good mood. I walked around to the back to get in position to push it out, as I'd become somewhat accustomed to lately. And Gunnar got in the driver's seat to drive it out, and he turned the key, and then he stuck his head out the window and shouted back, "Well, I think we might have another dead battery here as well." So I kind of sighed, and I walked up the right side of the van to confer about this new situation, and just happened to look down and notice that not one, but both right tires were also completely flat, apparently from rock punctures on this terrible road that we'd driven up in the dark. Not only that, but the entire rear bumper assembly was just gone, missing. We never found it again. It's probably still on the side of that mountain somewhere, ripped off. So on a remote mountain in central Peru, stuck in the mud with a dead battery and 2 flat tires, incidentally with a plane to catch that same afternoon. I was like, Gunnar, I don't think we're going to drive out of here this time. I think we probably just need to start walking at this point and see if we can find some help. And Gunnar said, yeah, well, you're probably right. So I was fine. I just had my little backpack, and I put that on, started walking down this mountain. No idea how many miles we'd have to go before we found someone. And Gunnar, meanwhile, gets his stuff out of the back seat, and he starts walking behind me with 2 airport wheelie bags of luggage, one dangling from each hand. As it turned out, we did have to go several miles like that before finally, thankfully, we eventually came around a corner and ran into a group of Andean potato farmers, these teenagers, who looked up with the expressions you might assume a group of Andean potato farmers might have upon seeing a couple of gringo-looking gentlemen walking down their mountainside carrying airport luggage in each hand. But Gunnar did not miss a beat. He put down one of his bags on the spot, and he unzipped it to show that it was completely stuffed, full of fresh oranges. And I just started laughing. I was like, Gunnar, that must weigh like 35 pounds. Are you going to carry these all the way down? And he was like, yeah, but watch this. And he started tossing the oranges out to all these farmers, whose expressions then lit up. All activity ceased, and we sat down with them and had this orange-eating powwow picnic lunch before they popped back up to their feet and said, well, okay, who wants a ride back down to the bottom? Which meant that we just made it in the nick of time to get to the airport that evening and have the gate attendant look at us with a big smile and say, your flight has been canceled. I did eventually make it out of Peru with some pretty good birds to show for it, and continued on my way up to the neighboring country of Ecuador to the north, which has beautiful cloud forests like this. And I wanted to make a pilgrimage here to visit an angel of peace. Literally, the name of this gentleman is Angel Paz, and he's got quite a compelling story. So, according to legend, in a former life, this particular angel used to be a logger, and he was cutting down all the trees on his cloud forest property in northwest Ecuador, when one day a couple of bird watchers stopped by, and they said, oh, Angel, do you know where we might be able to find an Andean cock of the rock? This bizarre neon orange bird with a strange display. And Angel kind of went, well, yeah, you mean those red birds? Sure, I got some out back. I guess I can show you. So they started walking back there. But before they got to the cock of the rock lek, a little brown bird hopped out of the bushes at their feet into the path. And the birders stopped in their tracks. And they said, Angel, forget about the cocks of the rock. If you can show this little brown bird to visitors, they will actually pay you money to come here and see it because it is so rare. And then they left very happily. And Angel got thinking about this encounter, and he thought, well, I know that little brown bird. it likes to follow me around sometimes when I'm cutting trees down. I think it eats the worms that are disturbed in the process of logging. In fact, I've already given it my own nickname. I like to call it Maria. Maybe I can make friends with Maria. So he set about on this campaign to befriend this little bird on his property. Fast forward a few years, I arrived on Angel Paz's property in 2015, where he met me, and took me onto a trail system behind his house. We stopped at a particular spot. He had some worms in a leaf. I don't know if you can see there in the lower right-hand corner, which he set down on a fence post. And then he cupped his hands around his mouth, and he went, Maria, Maria, venga, venga, venga. Sure enough, like 20 seconds later, this little brown bird hops out of the bushes right into the path. This is called a giant ant pitta. It's the largest of the ant pitta family, which there's about 50 species in South and Central America, and perhaps the rarest as well. In fact, the only place where you can reliably see a giant ant pitta these days is on Angel Paz's property, unless you want to go tramping around the cloud forest on your own for a couple of months and hope you get lucky. So Angel flipped Maria a couple of worms for her breakfast, as he does now every single day at 7 o'clock a.m., visitors or not. And she ate them and posed for us in a couple of profiles, and then she hopped back into the bushes, and I figured the show was over. Except Angel has kind of honed his act over the past few years, so we then continued a little farther down the trail, where he did the same thing with a yellow-breasted ant pitta, and then he did the same thing with a chestnut-crowned ant pitta, and then he did the same thing with this one, which might be my personal favorite, actually. This is called an ochre-breasted ant pitta. It's tiny. It's about the size and shape of an egg upright on two legs. And Angel's got his own nicknames for all these birds. This one he likes to call Shakira, because it's got a unique habit of twitching its chest from side to side when it gets very, very excited. He's done quite well for himself, in any case, with this whole ant pitta feeding operation. So when I arrived, he had just built himself and his family this beautiful new several-story house in the cloud forest with extra rooms upstairs for visiting birders to stay in and hand-carved ant pitta artwork embedded in the walls. He's now visited by more than 2,500 birders every year, every one of whom pays an entry fee to come see these celebrity ant pittas. He's become kind of the king of his own area. So I think this is quite an inspiring story, actually, of a conservation success. Because here's a guy who discovered all on his own that rather than cutting down his forest, he could make a much better living by keeping that forest and its birds completely intact. I continued on northward up through Central America, the Caribbean, and Mexico, and wound up in the interior of northern Mexico. This is the state of Durango, just south of the U.S. border, in mid-May. And I met there a local birder named Renee. We were out one evening at about 10 p.m. after dark, looking for nocturnal birds with a spotlight. And we found this little bird sitting on the ground. Even at this point, I wasn't quite sure what this bird was, because there are several species of nightjars, as they're called, in that part of the world. But fortunately, I had my field guide loaded up on my phone, so I just held my phone up with the field guide next to the bird itself and compared the field marks back and forth, and eventually decided that this was a common PRORWILL, which I am very familiar with. We have common PRORWILLs right here in Oregon, in the east side, in the high desert. I've seen a lot of common PRORWILLs during my lifetime, but this particular PRORWILL in northern Mexico turned out to be kind of a special one. First of all, because I had heard before that you can sometimes sort of hypnotize nightjars with a flashlight, almost like a deer in the headlights kind of effect. I'd never tried it before, but I ended up getting so close to this PRORWILL on the ground that I was face down on my stomach. I reached out my right hand and very gently petted the bird on the back of its head. Well, it didn't even move a feather. And then I backed off and turned the flashlight off, and the bird flew off into the evening. And then I realized that this PRORWILL that I'd just been petting in northern Mexico was bird number 2,500. On the date of May 16th, that was about the first time that I started to realize, well, if I keep this up, I might just find more than 5,000 birds this year. But who knew what was possible? Birders around the world were making all kinds of bets as to what I eventually come up with, because nobody had really any idea. Nobody had ever attempted anything quite this ambitious before. And I still had quite a few miles to travel. I crossed the US border in late May into southern Texas. I didn't really spend that much time here in my home country, just because there's not too many birds in the US and other temperate parts of the world compared to the tropics. So I did spend 2 days in southern Texas, a day and a half in southeast Arizona, 1 long day out of Los Angeles in California. I came home to Oregon for several days at the end of May, partly so I could get a haircut as I came through. And then continued on, and my last stop in North America was in the state of New York, where I came down in early June in Ithaca because I wanted to hang out with some friends there from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, including Tim Lenz here, who is a programmer working for eBird, which is the website/app that I was using to keep track of all my sightings along the way. And Tim had volunteered to take me around the outskirts of Ithaca for an afternoon, trying to find some common local birds there that he gets to see all the time, but I hadn't necessarily found yet because I hadn't been to New York or the Northeast US yet during the year. So we were spotting birds like upland sandpipers in the grass next to the road, and I think we were actually trying to find an American black duck that afternoon, which, to be honest, is kind of a trash bird in New York. It's everywhere. It's kind of like mallards are here in Oregon. Tim said, I think we can probably find an American black duck for your list sometime this afternoon. So we were on this quest. When sometime around mid-afternoon, Tim suddenly got this message on WhatsApp on his phone. He was driving, but he slammed on the brakes and pulled off to the side to read this message, and I knew that expression. It was like, Tim, what is it? What rare bird has just been reported? And he said, you are not going to believe this. I said, what? He said, a brown pelican has just been reported from Cayuga Lake. Do you realize how rare this is? It's like the first inland record of a brown pelican ever from this part of New York State. We've got to go find this pelican right now before it can turn around and fly away, and so I can get it for my county list. And I said, okay. Tim, you realize I just saw like 10,000 brown pelicans last week in California where they're supposed to be. I don't really need to see this one in New York. In fact, I kind of need to find a black duck this afternoon. And you could see this expression of horror crossing his face. I knew the feeling because I'm often the first one out the door when unusual birds show up in Oregon. So we compromised on a detour to try to go see this wayward pelican that was not going to give me anything for my big year. And meanwhile, the reports kept coming in with up to the second updates of speed and direction of this pelican as it was cruising down the lakeshore. So we were able to get ahead of it and position ourselves at a certain marina about 90 seconds before we looked off into the distance and saw a speck appear over the horizon. And then, sure enough, this pelican flew right over our heads. Tim was extremely excited. And then it continued on over downtown Ithaca, where the reports kept coming in. It's over the farmer's market right now. It's over campus right now. Leave class. Ditch your professors. Look at the sky. We did eventually get to find a black duck that afternoon, so all were happy. But I thought this was a good illustration, I guess, of how doing a big year on a global scale completely flips the strategy over from doing it on any smaller scale. Even if you're crazy enough to take on a whole continent, like those guys in that Hollywood movie did, you're pretty much totally reliant on finding these lost, out-of-range, vagrant birds that blow into your area, and then when they do get reported, you've got to jump in your car or even on a plane and go see that one individual bird before it can then turn around and fly back over the border, and you're no longer allowed to count it on your list. But if you just do the whole world, you don't have to worry about these vagrant birds. In fact, you are not rewarded for finding birds outside of their normal range, because eventually you'll just go see them where they're supposed to be. And I found that kind of refreshing, actually, about this particular trip, that it was more about seeking out the common local birds in the places where they normally live than it was about sort of ambulance chasing all of these vagrants around all the time. I guess I won't say too much here about my favorite subject, American/United Airlines, but suffice to say, out of a whole year of budget travel all over the map, my worst delay of the entire year would be trying to leave New York City. I was held back by about 27 hours, which was kind of a bummer there, because my next planned layover was supposed to be in Iceland, where I had planned just over one day to pick up all my Arctic birds there for the year before continuing on over to Europe. And by the time the new itinerary came down, they had me landing in Reykjavik at midnight and then taking off again shortly before 7 o'clock a.m. I was like, well, thanks. There goes all my Arctic species for the year. But then I got thinking about it, and I realized it was June. It doesn't get dark in Iceland during the northern summer. So I called up my local contact there, and I said, Jan, I haven't met you before. Don't worry about it. Just I'll take a taxi and drive around, see if I can find some birds, and then continue on my way. But, if you want to, might be kind of fun to pull an all-nighter of birding. What do you think? And he didn't even hesitate on the phone. He said, okay, yep, sounds good. I'll see you there when you land. So sure enough, I came down in Reykjavik, and within minutes, literally under the midnight sun, was scoping for Manx shearwaters offshore from the airport with this birder I'd never met before in my life named Jan. And then for the next several hours, we raced around the outskirts of the city together, picking off new birds left and right. We saw Atlantic puffin at this sea cliff at 3 o'clock in the morning. 4 o'clock in the morning, there were whooper swans by the side of the road. 5 a.m., black-tailed godwits. There were new birds all over the place, actually. Here I think I got 3 new birds at once. Yeah, gray-lag goose, Arctic tern, black-headed gull. Again, I hadn't been to that latitude yet during the year, so even the common local resident birds were new for my list. And we ended up at our last stop at about 6 a.m. at this lagoon, which turned out to be just outside the presidential palace there in the background. I could just imagine Iceland's president sleeping in there when this photo was taken, probably dreaming about his amazing yard list of birds he'd seen out the front window. And I turned around to Jan and I said, I can't thank you enough. Do you realize we have just seen 54 species of birds between midnight and 6 o'clock. I hope you can at least go home and get some sleep now. And he sort of laughed, and he said, yeah, well, kind of. And I said, what do you mean, kind of? And he said, well, I'm not really from Reykjavik. And I said, what do you mean? Where do you live? And he said, I'm actually from up toward northern Iceland. So I had to drive for about 5 hours just to come meet you at midnight. We've been birding now until 6 o'clock. Now I'm going to try to sleep here about an hour and a half in my truck in the airport parking lot before I need to turn around and drive 5 hours back home because I'm actually due back at work today. this is the kind of generosity that people will come up with when you have a passionate project like this, and I ran into it over and over and over again throughout the year, and it just completely blew me away every time. So, not having slept myself at this point in about 36 straight hours with all these various delays, I then took the short connection from Oslo over to Reykjavik over to Oslo in central Norway, and met my next contact there, this very nice birder named Bjorn in the Oslo cemetery, actually a pretty good birding spot. It was kind of like swapping in fresh horses for the postal service or something at this point, because of course Bjorn was very well rested, and he was not about to let me miss any birds on his home territory, which would reflect poorly on his own birdwatching ability. So his plan for the next 4 days in central Norway, where it also does not really get dark during the northern summer, was that we'd drive around together during the day and see these amazing birds, like Lapland longspurs nesting up on the mountain slopes, which were just melting off in mid-spring. And then in Norway, according to law, you are allowed to camp pretty much wherever you want, even on private property, as long as you're not on someone's backyard, exactly. So he just brought along a couple of sleeping bags, and when it started to get dusky around 11:30, 11:45 p.m., we'd throw those down wherever we dropped in the forest, sleep there for a couple of hours, and then get up again when the sun came up at about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, and keep going. And after 4 more days of that, I was about ready to say, I need to go to a country where it gets dark. I am going to die. This is not sustainable. But it was kind of fun to be camping out like this, partly because when I had first set off on this whole adventure, I'd started a daily blog on the National Audubon Society's website so people could follow along. And when Audubon set up that blog, they sent a photographer to my house just outside of Eugene to take a photo to serve as the illustration for the blog's home landing page. So this is the picture that photographer came up with. I don't know if you can really tell, but this photo is pretty much completely fake, okay? So I'm sitting there in a sleeping bag reading a copy of my own book while I'm spotlighting an owl up there that's actually a plastic owl that's been nailed to the top of that tree. And this was taken in broad daylight with floodlights to make it look like it was after dark. And so I'd been staring at this faked blog photo on my own homepage every day for the whole year, kind of laughing about it, until on the 3rd evening in Norway, in this haze of sleep deprivation, Bjorn and I threw down our sleeping bags on a random forest road at the end of the day and crawled in. And just before we passed out unconscious for the evening, we heard in the distance the sound of a tawny owl calling from the forest. So Bjorn pulled out his cell phone, and from it he played a snippet of a tawny owl, which the owl thought was another owl. So it flew in and landed in a tree right over our heads. And from his sleeping bag, Bjorn spotlighted the owl sitting right up there on a branch over our heads. So in the end, the faked blog photo ended up coming almost 100% true in central Norway. I didn't spend too long in Europe. Kind of like the US, there's just not that many birds compared to other parts of the tropics. So I spent 1 week in Europe between Norway, Turkey, and Spain. Before that, I then dropped down into Africa for the next 2.5 months. And for me, I think Africa was probably the most exotic part of this trip in many ways. It was the only continent that I'd never visited personally before I first set out. So everything was new for me. The landscapes changed quite dramatically. The people and the cultures obviously changed quite dramatically as well. And the wildlife changed too. All of a sudden, besides birds, there's all these other animals around all the time, which was super cool, especially for someone who's never seen this stuff before. Also, at times, a little bit distracting when you're trying to find little brown birds in the bushes and that kind of thing. I mean, it was amazing to get sightings of, like, the big cats. I had incredible encounters in several places with lions. I came face to face with a leopard in Kruger National Park in South Africa. In northern Tanzania, I got to watch cheetahs hunting out on the grasslands in the Serengeti. This is like stuff you see out of nature documentaries. When you're looking for birds, you see everything else that's out there at the same time. In fact, especially on safari, I often found that it was the groups of birders that ended up seeing more of all the other wildlife than the people who were only out there looking for the big, obvious stuff, if that makes sense. But I was legitimately looking for birds, so, you know, when the elephant was at the water hole, I was quite excited about the fish eagle perched up above its head. And when the buffalo came charging toward us, I was very happy about the oxpecker clinging to its back. The birds use the other wildlife as habitat in Africa. This doesn't really happen in other parts of the world. So you've got things like jacanas sitting on top of hippos' heads in Uganda. Sometimes the birds will stop traffic all on their own, though. This is a southern ground hornbill crossing the street, again in Kruger National Park in South Africa. But I started noticing something, again, on safari, which was that I'd be out in some kind of jacked up Land Cruiser or something with a group of birders looking for birds, and we'd find something amazing, like, say, a giant kingfisher sitting alongside the road. Biggest kingfisher in the world. This is about twice as big as our belted kingfisher around here. So we'd stop and we'd be checking it out and looking at it and drinking in the views as you do and getting really excited and taking photos and smacking high fives with each other. And then after about a minute and a half, you would turn around and there'd be like 15 other safari trucks parked bumper to bumper behind you, all of them wanting to know where the lion was that you were so obviously excited about. And as soon as they realized that you're just looking at some bird, there'd be these expressions of like disappointment and disgust that you'd wasted precious seconds of their vacation, and they'd drive off in a big cloud of dust. And this got to be kind of an issue for us after a while. So we eventually came up with a solution, which was that anytime someone parked behind our bumper, one of the local guys had a copy of the field guide with a big unmistakable picture of a bird on the front cover. And we just roll down the window and wave it out the window at them, and they'd see it and realize we were looking at birds. And at that point, generally, people would just leave us alone. We called that maneuver flipping them the bird. On that note, I think we will take a break here for a few minutes, as I understand you're accustomed to. And alrighty. So just a couple more stories, and then we can have some time for questions. But yes, so after Africa, of course, things changed quite dramatically as well. And I continued onward into Asia, where I was quite impressed, actually, in parts of Asia with how many birders there are in a lot of these Asian countries. I'd go to national parks in Africa, and they'd be full of foreigners with very few locals. And I'd go to national parks in Asia, and they would also be full of people, but they'd almost all be locals with very few foreigners in a lot of these places. And so places like India, I'd email one guy ahead of time, and he'd say, oh, sure, I can take you out birding. And I'd show up, and he'd have invited all of his friends to come along for the day as well. So I had these like posses of birders showing me around in various places, which was great. There are even young birders in places like India. This is a very endangered species, but that's Ramit on the left is 24 years old, and Taksh on the right. I spent a day with these guys outside of Delhi. He was 14 years old, and as far as I could tell, knew all of the local birds and their behaviors and vocalizations just about as well as any of the established experts in those areas. So I was quite heartened to see that there's this new generation of birders coming up, even in some of these more far-flung places. But it was in southern India that I was fortunate to come across this bird. Can you see the bird in this picture? There are actually two birds. There's a gray one in front and a red one crossways just behind it. This is a pair of Sri Lanka frogmouths found in South India. And the Sri Lanka frogmouth was bird number 4,342, which meant that officially, as of September 16th, I had now passed that existing big year world record, which, to be honest, I wasn't really thinking too hard about. My own goal was to get to 5,000, which was still a ways off, and I didn't really see this trip as like trying to beat something that somebody else had accomplished. As more of a personal quest in most ways, I guess. But it was kind of cool to suddenly realize that you've just done something that no human being in history has ever accomplished before. And I've got to say, if you're going to break a world record of any kind, then India is definitely the place to do it. I don't know what it is. They are crazy about world records in India. Some hugely disproportionate number of Guinness Book of World Records submissions come from the country of India. And so when I was looking at these very inanimate frogmouths sleeping up in a tree, the word had kind of leaked out about this world record attempt in progress. And people showed up out of the woodwork. I was being videotaped for national news as I was looking at these birds. And this is an actual religious bishop had apparently come driven 150 kilometers just to shake my hand because he'd heard about this. He said, "I had a feeling you would break the record today." And I said, "Great. Are you a bird watcher?" And he said, "I have an interest in all living things." I said, "That's wonderful. I just love this enthusiasm." And again, that carried over as I continued on to other countries all over Southeast Asia where birding has really taken off just in the past 10 or 15 years in some of these places. It's increased in popularity in the US as well, but in some of these other countries, it never existed before at all. And I think it has a lot to do with digital photography coming up and the internet bringing people together and field guides and all of these different factors. In any case, I'd land in a place like Taipei, Taiwan, and again, a whole posse of birders picked me up at the airport, treating me like this visiting dignitary celebrity birder by this point, which was kind of cool. But these guys decided that they were going to take me out to see a celebrity of their own just outside the Taipei city limits. So just after I landed, we caravanned outside the city to take a look at this bird, which is called a Siberian crane. This was actually the first individual Siberian crane ever recorded in the country of Taiwan. I didn't find it. This bird had already been there for about 5 months before I arrived. And by then, it was a legitimate celebrity among the Taiwanese. They called it the little white crane. The government had assigned this bird its own 24-hour security guard to make sure that nothing harmful could happen to it, because it was seen as this pure symbol of Taiwanese Siberian ambassadorship and all of this stuff. And so I got to see it. The crane was out there in the same farmer's field where it had been walking around next to a busy road just outside the city for the previous 5 months. But they'd set up barriers to keep people out of that field, and there were signs translated into several different languages about this one crane. There were even souvenir stands set up selling crane-themed knickknacks alongside the road. Again, this is a random Tuesday afternoon, 5 months after this bird had been there all day, every single day. There were dozens of people lining the street trying to get pictures of it and just get a glimpse of this celebrity bird. They estimated that by this point, approximately 60,000 people had come out just to take a look at this one lost crane. It was lost. This Siberian crane should not ever have been in Taiwan. They're actually an endangered species. There's only about 3,000 individuals left. They nest in Siberia, and then they should migrate to central China and back each year. They learn how to migrate from their parents, so this young one had evidently strayed off course and then ended up in Taiwan. So the question then was, well, what should we do with this crane? Should we leave it alone? Maybe it'll find its own way back. Should we try to capture it and transport it back to rejoin its flock somewhere? There were these arguments happening. But it didn't really matter in the end, because about a month after I saw it, this crane, one day, all on its own, got up and left, flew out of this farmer's field where it had just spent half a year of its young life. And then it came down that same evening, somewhat disoriented, and took shelter inside an urban subway station in Taipei while it was filmed on the news and everything. And then the following morning, it took off again, and this time much more purposefully flew straight out to sea and then disappeared over the horizon. And no one really knows if this crane was able to find its flock again somewhere, or if it's maybe even still out there bouncing around from one island to the next. My last country of the year, going into the home stretch, was planned to be Australia. And I came down first in the town of Cairns in northeast Australia, where I met a local birder there named Del Richards, and a reporter from the Cairns Post newspaper came out with us that morning because he wanted to write an article about the impending end of the big year. So this reporter was asking me all these questions, like, what bird do you most want to see in Australia? And I said, well, I've never seen a cassowary before. I'd really love to find one. And he said, oh, okay. And he wrote that down. The next morning, the headline in the paper was something like, birdwatcher wants to break world record with the cassowary in Cairns. I was like, well, kind of. I would really like to see a cassowary, though. So a couple of hours after the paper came out that morning, I got a call, because my number was in that article. And this guy came on the line, and he said, hey, I saw the paper this morning. Have you found one of them cassowaries yet? And I said, no. Do you know where I might find one? I don't have a good stakeout. And he said, well, yeah, I've got a cass and a couple chicks. Likes to hang out around my backyard. I just saw him like a minute ago. If you want to come over, I guess. And I said, hold on right there. I am on my way. And jumped into the car with Del, and we drove up to what turned out to be this beautiful property in the wet tropical forest overlooking the city, where this very nice gentleman met me in his driveway and then took me around to the backside of his property, where, sure enough, there's this bird that looks like a dinosaur. I mean, technically speaking, all birds are the last living lineage of dinosaurs that never quite died out and just kept on evolving. But this one really looks like it, with that weird helmet thing on top of its head and these neck wattles hanging down. This is a really big bird. This is about 6 feet tall. Second heaviest bird in the world after the ostrich. Somewhat dubiously reputed, I think, sometimes, to be the world's most dangerous bird, because technically it is the only bird that's ever directly killed a human being by direct blunt force trauma. If they kick you hard enough in the stomach, they can actually disembowel you, and they have this special sharpened central toenail for that purpose, and there's been some incidents in the past. They're kind of aggressive, but this one seems super friendly, so I didn't see a big deal with hanging out with this male, definitely the father cassowary, that always takes care of the chicks. One of the coolest bird encounters I think I've ever had anywhere in my entire life. Least Christmassy Christmas I've had in my entire life This was the only Christmas tree I saw all day. On the 25th of December, it was about 95 degrees in this place called Payne's Find, which is several hundred kilometers inland from Perth in southwest Australia. In fact, I didn't see another human being all day long on Christmas, except for this birder named Frank from Perth, who had volunteered to spend his whole day bird watching with me on the holiday in the middle of nowhere, which I was quite grateful for. But, you know, if you're in the right festive mood and frame of mind, then any tree could theoretically be a Christmas tree on the 25th of December. So I was quite happy to see this one that had a sort of maybe green and red bird in it for the holiday, if you're creative. This bird is called a Bork's parrot. And on the 25th of December, this Bork's parrot was bird number 5,963. I had blasted by my initial goal of 5,000 months earlier in October in the Philippines, and then just kept right on going. So I went back to Frank's house that evening for Christmas dinner, where we had Cornish game hens. I enjoy birds in every way possible. And I said, Frank, look, I've already exceeded my original goal here by almost 1,000 species. It's all gravy, really, at this point. But, you know, it would be kind of criminal to come so close to 6,000 and not quite get there. How are we going to do this? I've got to find 37 more birds in the next few days before New Year. So we stayed up late into the evening that night, painstakingly making a list of every last bird anywhere in Australia that I had not yet found. And eventually decided that it was not possible. Maybe if I had a few weeks to track them down one by one, but not in a few days. The distances in Australia are just too big to be able to zip around like that. So then I said, well, okay, Frank, it has been wonderful bird watching with you over the holidays here, but where in the world could I go to get 37 more birds? I've only got one shot at this. And fortunately for me, that same year, 2015, eBird, the app website that I was using, had just come out with a new feature called Target Species, which will filter all of the reported bird sightings from any given region of the world against your own personal list and export that in descending order of frequency of encounters, I think to 7 decimal points. So it will literally give you a target list for anywhere you could care to go. And I ran that for a whole bunch of different places and eventually calculated that the one place I could kind of go back to that I hadn't necessarily done properly the first time around, which was probably a strategic error on my part, was the country of India. But this time, way up in the northeast part of India, in the eastern Himalayan foothills, in the province of Assam, there were a whole bunch of different endemic birds that I had not seen anywhere else. So some fairly fancy footwork on Christmas evening with booking international plane tickets for the following day and getting visas sorted out and all the rest. 24 hours after spending a blistering holiday on the Australian outback, I came down at 8,000 feet in the eastern Himalayas in the dead of winter. It was well below freezing. The sun sets at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon that time of year there because of the crazy time zones in India. There are no time zones in India. It's all the same one. And I met, again, these hardcore, gung-ho, young Indian birders. That's Ramit on the right, who I just showed you earlier. He invited a couple more friends along for the last few days to go hard and try to find these last 37 birds. We ended up seeing this bird. there is a bird in this picture, I swear. It's right there. This is a terrible photo of a really good bird, actually, called a yellow-rumped honey guide, which is only found in that eastern Himalayan region within a narrow elevational range, almost always next to vertical rock faces, like you can see here, that inevitably also have an active honeybee hive attached, hence the name. So quite specific habitat for this bird. But when we found this guy, I was literally jumping up and down in this dusty Himalayan road because on the 29th of December, this yellow-rumped honey guide was bird number 6,000. Of course, I still had 2 more days, so I didn't quite stop there. Technically, the very last bird I saw at about 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve was this nice little owl called an Oriental Bay Owl. And I snapped this photo, and then Ramit was standing next to me, and he turned around and he said, "Do you realize how rare this owl is here?" And I said, "Well, no, I wasn't really expecting to see one, but how rare?" And he said, "As far as I know, this is the first photograph ever taken of an Oriental Bay owl anywhere in the country of India." And I said, "Okay, that's my last bird. The big year is a wrap." By the time the dust settled, I had visited 41 countries on all 7 continents. When I added up all the segments, I flew almost exactly 100,000 miles over the course of this trip. That might sound like a lot. That's about the same as maybe 4 round trips from here to Australia. It averaged out to 1 flight every 3 or 4 days, maybe. Each of those was only an hour or 2 at the very most to get to the next spot, which I booked after dark to preserve my daylight hours for bird watching. So I didn't actually spend that much of my time in and around airports, which might seem kind of counterintuitive looking at this map. I think I spent about $60,000 US on the whole trip, all expenses included, all of the travel, accommodation, food, some local guides, gear, different places. Again, I only throw that out there to say that maybe that sounds like a lot. Maybe that sounds like not so much, actually. To me, $10 per bird seemed like a pretty small price to pay for this trip. And I think it goes to show that traveling, like many other things, can be done on a variety of different budgets. It is a priority like anything else. Would you rather visit 41 different countries, or would you rather have a nice SUV in your driveway at home? And these are literally the choices that we make every day, whether it's consciously or maybe more subconsciously sometimes. I know I said earlier when I started out, it wasn't all just about the numbers and the listing and all the rest of it. The numbers themselves were maybe even a little more fleeting than I had even envisioned. I finished the year officially with 6,042 species of birds, according to the Clements checklist, out of the 10,365 recognized. About 60% of the world's birds, beating that existing world record by about 1,700 species. The very instant I finished this trip, another young birder from the Netherlands set out on his own round-the-world birdwatching adventure, largely using this map as a blueprint, having learned from all of my strategic mistakes along the way. And he ended up, the end of 2016, the very next year, having seen even a couple hundred more birds than I did. So right away, my world record was broken, which I think is quite entertaining, actually. More power to him. That's what records are for. And to anyone else who decides to take on this challenge in the coming years and find ways to take it in new and interesting directions. When I finished, I could have told you off the top of my head the names and the field marks of all 6,042 birds. I had them down, but after a year of nothing else, I was a bird watching machine at that point. Now, to be honest, a couple years later, some of the more obscure birds that I saw in places that I wasn't necessarily that familiar with have started to kind of evaporate. It's hard to keep your Comeropteras and Iramomolas and Zitting and Boleaginous hemispinguses straight. But I do still remember pretty much all of the birders that I met along the way that year. These are the memories that stick with you the most when you travel, I think, on any kind of trip. All of the new friendships and the connections and the characters you meet along the way, especially when you have this intense shared interest. The thing about birds, of course, is that they are very universal. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. Anywhere, anyone on Earth can get interested in birds. And so I didn't even necessarily have to speak the same language as a lot of these people, which I didn't. I spent a very quiet week with a guy in Myanmar on the back of a motorbike who knew all of his birds but not English, and we were still able to get along great. So if I can help spread some of that inspiration of birds as far and wide to the farthest reaches of this planet, and maybe not so far as well, then I think after a big adventure like this, then that is by far the best possible outcome of all. And on that note, thank you so much for having me up here this afternoon. So yes, we've got some time for quick questions if anyone has questions about birds or where babies come from. Oh, okay. Yes, they're in the back.
I'm Arthur. The question I have is, who decides what to name the birds? How does that happen?
Oh yeah, who decides what to name birds? It's kind of random sometimes, actually. Most of the birds that we're dealing with were named centuries ago, and it's whatever scientist describes that species and publishes it. So if you find a legitimately new bird now, you're allowed to give it whatever name you want, really, except there are some rules that are sort of unspoken. You're not allowed to name a bird after yourself, for instance. So what you really want is for someone else to find a new bird and then name it after you. But most of the birds were named when they were all being discovered, which now is, the golden ages of that, or a century or two ago. And some of them got a little mixed up. So there's cases like there's a couple of tanagers in Central and South America named the turquoise tanager and the paradise tanager. One of them is, the scientific name is chilensis, and the other one, the scientific name is mexicanus. Neither of them are found anywhere near Chile or Mexico. It seems like what happened is those specimens were mislabeled. They came from somewhere else and shipped back to London, and then they were just naming them, and the name stuck. So there's a lot of birds like that. Even here in the U.S., the Tennessee warbler does not really nest in Tennessee. The Nashville warbler does not really nest in Nashville. The ringneck duck does not have a visible ring on its neck. The orange-crowned warbler, you can only see the orange on its crown if you have one in the hand, like the people did back in the shotgun days of ornithology. So, yeah, some of the bird names are a little odd, especially the ones that are named after these ornithologists from generations ago that have sort of been forgotten now, except for their names, which stuck to these birds. So if you go to Europe and you see a Brunix guillemot, that's what we call a thick-billed murre. That's named after some Danish ornithologist from the 1700s. So some of them get a little strange sometimes.
Thank you so much. It's just fun. I feel like we've been on a great adventure. My name is Gretchen. My question is, did you run across any birds that you couldn't identify that you thought, oh my gosh, I've discovered a new species here? Because it's so impressive that you would be able to identify 6,000, but were there any
Sure.
unknowns?
Yeah, did I run across any birds that I couldn't identify and think I'd found a new species? Well, first of all, I'm not an expert necessarily on identifying birds in all these far-flung places. I was going quite deliberately from point to point, so I was never quite overwhelmed because in general most of the birds were overlap with where I had just been. So it was a good way for me to learn new birds in these places, but I was really relying often on these local birders who really knew the birds in their home areas. Just like if someone came to Oregon, I could show them all the secret spots around here and find all the birds. So it was nice to be able to have that kind of company in the field, and that really helped. That was a key part of the strategy. As far as finding new species of birds these days, there may be one or two out there in the Amazon still that are legitimately new that look nothing like anything else, but for the most part, if you see in the news that a bird species has been discovered, it's almost always someone in a lab somewhere looking at that bird's DNA and deciding that it's just this much different than an existing bird's DNA in a different place, that we're going to split it and call it a different bird. That has had a huge effect on birds of the world. As of the 1980s, there were supposedly 8,000 birds on Earth, and now because of all these DNA splits, we're up to about 10,500. And the world bird list has been going up quite steadily lately at about 1% per year, if you want to call it species inflation, because of this research. There was actually a paper that came out 2 years ago now that looked at that and tried to estimate how many birds should be on Earth, and they estimated that we might eventually end up with something like 18,000 birds in the world. But it's going to take about 90 years to push all of that research through. So I guess I can just sit in my armchair now for the rest of my life and tick off these armchair lifers as they're newly minted by scientists. As for myself, probably the rarest bird I saw during this year was in New Guinea. I had seen a YouTube video a couple months before I went there and changed my flight ticket because of it to go to a different island called New Britain, just to the northeast of New Guinea, where I met a guy who worked at a dive resort that was not often visited by birders, and he took me out into a palm oil plantation, of all places, after dark, and we spotlighted there an owl called a golden masked owl that looks a lot like a barn owl but is endemic to that one island. And prior to 2015, this owl had not been seen alive in approximately 30 years. So people thought it might have even been extinct, except then it was rediscovered, and I was probably one of the first 5 people to see it in my own lifetime. So that was pretty special. Even though it wasn't a new species, it was one that we thought might have not quite existed anymore.
Noah, up here, in looking at your schedule ahead the next 4 or 5 months, could you share with us a little more what you're doing on these expeditions and where they are? And
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, what's next? How do you follow a trip like this up? Well, on to more adventures. So I guess I should say that I've written a book about this whole trip. It's called Birding Without Borders. It just came out last October, and it's coming out in paperback next week. So you can order it on Amazon or wherever. I do have 1 copy left up here that I'm happy to sign for you, as well as a couple of my other books. So you can come see me up here after class if you so choose. But meanwhile, after I finished the big year, I got back home and I was kind of mentally messed up on birds at this point. After 365 days of doing nothing but looking at birds, my worst fear was that I would just hate birds at the end of this whole thing, get burned out. But it was actually the opposite. I didn't know how to stop and go back to normal life. And so, for instance, after the year was over, I set my alarm for 5 a.m. the next morning on January 1st and went birding because I didn't know what else to do anymore. And then I had to kind of step myself back down to reality. So it took me a couple of months after I got back home to assume something like a normal life again. And then I was contacted by National Geographic because they said, well, in 2018, this year, we're declaring it the Year of the Bird because it is the centennial of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act this year, which was passed 100 years ago. And so in celebration of that, we're doing all this bird-related stuff. Nat Geo has run bird articles in every issue of the magazine this year. They have put a lot of bird stuff on their TV programs, and they decided to do a book. So I wrote the essays for a photo book that came out this year called Birds of the Photo Ark, with a photographer named Joel Sartori, who is a Nat Geo photographer who's been working on his own project called the Photo Ark for the past 10 years or so. He goes around the world photographing birds and other animals in zoos and captive breeding facilities, setting up a portrait studio, literally, with lights and everything, and then taking these intimate eyeball-to-eyeball images of them. And they've used those pictures in all kinds of stuff. But they got a bunch of the best bird images together with my essays and put them together in this book. So that just came out this year. And then I'm leading trips to various places. I work about 3 or 4 months out of each year now for an expedition company that goes to Antarctica and the high Arctic. So I'll be going back down to Antarctica this November for another emperor penguin trip on a Russian icebreaker with a couple helicopters, which should be pretty exciting. And between those, leading other bird trips to places like Cuba and Costa Rica for other organizations and other projects as they come up. So I feel very fortunate that I'm able to pursue birds as a 110% full-time career and do what I love. For me, it's not a job. It's really a lifestyle. And then one thing naturally leads to the next. Where's home? I'm from Eugene originally. I went to South Eugene High School. My parents live just outside of Cresswell. I have a house still in Corvallis, but I don't really spend much time there. In fact, it's rented out at the moment because I don't live anywhere in particular these days. So eventually, I suppose I'll actually live in one place for a while. But I come back to Oregon in between all these other adventures.
I think that's it for questions. Does anyone else have a question? No? Well, thank you very much, Noah, for a great
Sure, thank you.